Fall 1943, USS Bunker Hill, somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. Rear Admiral Masafumi Arima stood on the bridge of the Japanese aircraft carrier Shokaku, staring in disbelief through his binoculars at the American fleet on the horizon. Wave after wave of fighter aircraft launched from American carriers' sleek, powerful machines that outclassed anything in the Japanese arsenal. They moved with devastating speed and precision, tearing through the sky at nearly 400 miles per hour. The Admiral lowered his binoculars and turned to his staff. "Gentlemen," he said gravely, "if the Americans can produce these fighters at the rate intelligence suggests over 1,000 in a single month, then this war is already over." His voice, usually commanding and confident, carried a resignation that sent chills through his officers. None dared contradict him. What these experienced naval officers witnessed that day was the Grumman F6F Hellcat, a fighter plane that would transform the Pacific War and bring the mighty Japanese Naval Air Force to its knees in less than a year. What made this moment even more remarkable was that just 18 months earlier, American carrier aviation had been on the defensive, outclassed by the legendary Japanese Zero fighter. The Hellcats' arrival in such overwhelming numbers represented not just a technological achievement, but an industrial miracle that Japanese leadership had believed impossible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This story begins not with the thunder of combat over the Pacific, but in a quiet engineering office in Bethpage, Long Island, in January 1942, just weeks after the devastating Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The United States had been thrust into a global war it had hoped to avoid, and the stunning early Japanese victories in the Pacific had revealed a harsh truth. American fighters were no match for the nimble Japanese Zero. Leroy Grumman, founder of Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, called his chief design engineer Robert Hall into his office on a cold winter morning. The Navy had just delivered urgent news. The performance gap between American fighters and the Japanese Zero was even worse than initially thought. The Zero could outclimb, outturn, and outrun anything the Americans had in the air. Navy pilots were dying at alarming rates, fighting an enemy they couldn't catch and couldn't escape. "Bob," Grumman said, sliding a folder across his desk, "these are combat reports from Pearl Harbor and the Philippines. Our boys are flying coffins out there." Hall flipped through pages of desperate after-action reports. The technical performance data on the Zero was devastating. It could climb at 3,000 feet per minute, turn on a dime, and maintain combat effectiveness at altitudes above 30,000 feet. "The Navy's asking for improvements to the F4F Wildcat," Grumman continued, referring to their current fighter in service. "They want better climb rate, better high-altitude performance, incremental changes." Hall closed the folder and looked up. "Incremental won't cut it. The Wildcat's design is maxed out. We need something completely new." Grumman nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I wanted to hear. But the Navy wants more Wildcats, not a new design that'll take 2 years to develop." "So we convince them otherwise," Hall said firmly. "We show them why it has to be a clean sheet design." This exchange marked the beginning of what would become one of the most consequential aircraft development programs of World War II. Hall understood something that many naval planners did not. The fundamental limitations of the Wildcat couldn't be overcome with minor modifications. Its design had reached the limits of its potential. What was needed was a completely new aircraft designed specifically to counter the Zero's strengths. 2. Later, Hall and Grumman met with Commander Alfred Metzger, the Navy's lead fighter procurement officer, in Washington, D.C. The meeting was tense from the start. The Navy was desperate for more fighters, any fighters to stem the Japanese advance across the Pacific. "Gentlemen," Commander Metzger began, "I've reviewed your proposal for modifications to the F4F Wildcat. The changes look reasonable, but our pilots need these improvements yesterday, not 6 months from now." "Commander," Hall replied, "we didn't come here to discuss modifications to the Wildcat." He opened his briefcase and pulled out preliminary sketches of an entirely new fighter design. We're proposing a clean-sheet fighter specifically designed to defeat the Zero. Metzger's expression hardened. Mr. Hall, perhaps you don't understand our situation. We're losing carriers. We're losing pilots. We need improved fighters now, not a paper airplane that won't see combat for 2 years. 18 months, Hall corrected. And it will be worth the wait. 18 months? Metzger laughed without humor. Do you have any idea what the Pacific will look like in 18 months if we don't turn this around now? Leroy Grumman, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. Commander, we understand the urgency. But Bob's right. The Wildcat has reached its limits. Even with every modification you've requested, it still won't match the Zero. You'll just have a slightly less outclassed fighter. And you're suggesting we simply accept defeat for the next year and a half while you develop this new aircraft? Metzger asked incredulously. No, Hall said, placing a detailed analysis of the Zero's performance on the table. We continue producing Wildcats at maximum capacity, but we also begin this program immediately. He pointed to specific performance characteristics of the Zero. The Japanese fighter sacrifices structural strength for maneuverability and range. It has no armor protection for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks. It's essentially a flying gas can. Hall flipped to his design sketches. Our new fighter will be the opposite. Heavily armored, tremendously powerful, able to take punishment and keep flying. It will dive faster than the Zero, climb faster, and most importantly, he paused for emphasis, it will bring pilots home even after taking severe battle damage. Commander Metzger studied the drawings with growing interest. The proposed fighter featured a massive 2,000 horsepower engine nearly double the power of the Wildcat. Its wings were designed for high-speed performance rather than the low-speed turning battles that Japanese pilots preferred. Every aspect of the design reflected a fighter built not to dogfight with the Zero on its terms, but to impose a completely different style of aerial combat. And you're certain you can deliver this in 18 months? Metzger asked, his skepticism evident but beginning to waver. 14 if we push, Hall replied confidently. We've already begun preliminary work. Without Navy approval? Metzger raised an eyebrow. Let's call it patriotic initiative, Grumman interjected with a slight smile. The meeting continued for hours, with Hall methodically addressing every concern Metzger raised. The Navy officer was gradually swayed by the technical arguments and the comprehensive nature of Grumman's proposal. What finally tipped the balance wasn't just the fighter's projected performance, but Hall's detailed production plan. We can build these faster than the Wildcat, Hall explained. The design incorporates manufacturing efficiencies that will allow us to produce them at a rate the Japanese can't possibly match. Their industrial capacity is already at its limit. Ours is just getting started. By the end of the meeting, Metzger was convinced. Against conventional wisdom and the immediate demands of the Pacific War, he made the bold decision to approve development of what would become the F6F Hellcat, even while acknowledging it wouldn't reach squadrons for at least a year. As Hall and Grumman left the Pentagon that evening, the design engineer turned to his boss. That was the easy part, he said. Now we actually have to build this thing. Grumman nodded. And faster than we promised. The boys out there don't have the luxury of waiting. Back in Bethpage, Hall assembled his engineering team. William Schwendler would serve as the chief structural engineer, responsible for designing an airframe that could withstand combat damage yet remain light enough for carrier operations. Leon Swerble would oversee the manufacturing process, ensuring the fighter could be built in the quantities needed to overwhelm Japanese air power. Richard Hutton would lead the aerodynamics work, creating a wing design that maximized high-speed performance. Hall gathered them in the company's main drafting room and laid out the challenge before them. Gentlemen, what I'm about to ask of you has never been done before. We need to design, test, and deliver a world-beating fighter in less than 14 months. It needs to be faster than anything we've built, more powerful and more durable, yet simple enough that we can build thousands of them with minimal specialized labor. He pointed to the performance specifications on the chalkboard. The Navy needs a fighter that can climb at 3,400 feet per minute, reach a top speed of 380 miles per hour, operate at altitudes above 30,000 feet, and absorb punishment that would destroy any aircraft currently in our inventory. The room fell silent as the engineers absorbed the magnitude of the challenge. "There's more," Hall continued. "Our pilots will be facing an enemy with years more combat experience. This aircraft needs to be so intuitive to fly that a new pilot with minimal training can be effective on his first mission." "Impossible," one engineer muttered. "No," Hall corrected. "Difficult, but not impossible. And absolutely necessary. Every month we delay costs hundreds of American lives." Over the next few weeks, the engineering team worked around the clock, often sleeping on cots in the office rather than going home. The initial design concept rapidly evolved into detailed engineering drawings. The aircraft would be built around the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, generating 2,000 horsepower, a power plant so large that the entire fuselage had to be designed around it. Unlike the Japanese philosophy of lightweight maneuverability, the Hellcat embraced a distinctly American approach: overwhelming power, structural strength, and firepower. Where the Zero had two 20mm cannons and two machine guns, the Hellcat would carry 6 50-caliber machine guns, capable of firing 2,400 rounds per minute. Where the Zero offered no protection for its pilot, the Hellcat would include 212 pounds of armor plating. Where the Zero's fuel tanks would rupture and ignite when hit by even a single bullet, the Hellcat's tanks would be self-sealing, capable of taking multiple hits without leaking or catching fire. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The most radical departure from conventional design thinking came in the wing. Traditional wisdom held that fighter aircraft needed light wing loading for maneuverability. The Zero exemplified this approach with its large wing area relative to its weight. Hall's team took the opposite approach, designing wings optimized for high-speed dives and zooming climbs rather than tight turning battles. "We're not building a ballerina," Hall told his team. "We're building a heavyweight boxer. Our pilots won't try to outturn the Zero. They'll use power and speed to dictate the terms of engagement." By June 1942, just 6 months after that crucial meeting in Washington, the first XF6F1 prototype was taking shape on the factory floor. The pace was unprecedented, with engineers often making design changes on the spot as construction revealed unforeseen challenges. On the 25th of June 1942, as American and Japanese carriers clashed at the Battle of Midway in what would prove to be the turning point of the Pacific War, Hall received devastating news. The first flight tests of the Wright R2600 engine intended for the Hellcat showed it was delivering less power than expected. The performance targets would be impossible to meet. Hall called an emergency meeting of his engineering team. "The R2600 isn't cutting it," he announced. "We're going to have to redesign the aircraft for the Pratt & Whitney R2800. The room erupted in protests. The R2800 was significantly larger and heavier. Incorporating it would require major structural changes throughout the airframe. Weeks, perhaps months of work would be lost. "I know what this means," Hall said, silencing the room, "but we have no choice. The Navy needs a fighter that can outperform the Zero, not just match it. The R2800 gives us 2,000 horsepower to work with. That's a 25% increase over our original design." The team worked through the night, scrapping weeks of detailed drawings to accommodate the larger engine. What should have been a catastrophic setback instead became an opportunity. The R2800 Double Wasp would prove to be one of the most reliable aircraft engines ever built, capable of absorbing tremendous battle damage while continuing to function. On the 30th of August 1942, test pilot Bob Hall, no relation to the engineer, climbed into the cockpit of the XF6F3 prototype. The massive fighter, now powered by the R2800 engine, dwarfed the Wildcat sitting nearby on the runway. At 15,000 pounds fully loaded, it was nearly 50% heavier than the Wildcat it would replace. As engineers and Navy observers watched anxiously, Hall pushed the throttle forward. The enormous propeller bit into the air, and the Hellcat accelerated down the runway with unexpected agility. It lifted off after a remarkably short takeoff roll and climbed at a breathtaking rate that left witnesses stunned. For the next hour, Hall put the prototype through increasingly demanding maneuvers, testing its behavior at the edges of the performance envelope. When he finally landed and taxied back to the waiting crowd, his face told the story before he even removed his oxygen mask. He was grinning from ear to ear. "Well?" Robert Hall asked as the pilot climbed down. "It's not just good," the test pilot replied. "It's phenomenal. Handles like it's 2,000 pounds lighter than it actually is, climbs like an express elevator. The visibility from the cockpit is better than anything I've ever flown." Commander Frederick Trapnell, the Navy's chief test pilot who had been observing the flight, stepped forward. He had more combat experience against Japanese aircraft than almost anyone in the Navy, and had personally flown captured Zero fighters to understand their capabilities. "I want to fly it," he said simply. The next day, Trapnell took the Hellcat prototype up for a grueling 3-hour evaluation. When he returned, he immediately called Washington on a secure line. His report was succinct. "The F6F Hellcat is the fighter the Navy has been waiting for. Proceed with production at maximum priority." The Navy, initially hesitant to gamble on an unproven design, now threw its full weight behind the Hellcat program. Within weeks, the Bureau of Aeronautics increased the production order from the initial 400 aircraft to over 1,000, with promises of more to follow. Throughout the fall of 1942, as testing continued and minor refinements were made, Grumman transformed its production facilities to prepare for mass manufacturing of the new fighter. The Japanese advance had been stopped at Midway, but American forces were still on the defensive across much of the Pacific. The Hellcat couldn't arrive soon enough. In January 1943, the first production F6F3 Hellcats rolled off the assembly line in Bethpage. Incorporating lessons from the testing program, these aircraft featured enhanced cockpit visibility, improved armor protection, and more responsive control surfaces than the prototype. By February, the first operational Hellcats were being loaded onto transport ships bound for Pearl Harbor. Yet, even as the first squadrons began training with the new fighter, disturbing intelligence arrived from the front lines. The Japanese, aware of American aircraft development, were rushing their own next-generation fighter into production. Codenamed Jack by Allied intelligence, the Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden was rumored to be specifically designed to counter American high-altitude bombers and their fighter escorts. When this intelligence reached Grumman headquarters, Hall called yet another late-night meeting of his engineering team. "We need to do better," he told them. "The Japanese are already responding to a fighter they haven't even faced yet. We need to ramp up production and get these planes to the Pacific before they can counter it." Leon Swerbull, now overseeing production, spoke up. "We're already producing 30 aircraft a week. The factory is running 24 hours a day." "Make it 60?" Hall said. "Impossible," Swerbull replied. "We don't have the workforce, the machine tools." Hall interrupted. "Hire housewives, retirees, anyone who can hold a riveting gun. Subcontract parts production to smaller manufacturers. The Japanese built their air force over a decade. We need to match it in 1 year." What followed was one of the most remarkable industrial achievements in American history. Grumman's workforce expanded from 12,000 to over 25,000 workers in less than 6 months. Assembly lines operated around the clock, 7 days a week. Manufacturing innovations slashed production time per aircraft from thousands of man-hours to hundreds. While most military aircraft grew more complex and time-consuming to build as the war progressed, the Hellcat bucked the trend. Each successive batch incorporated manufacturing efficiencies that reduced construction time while maintaining or improving quality. Interchangeable parts, simplified assembly procedures, and innovative use of subcontractors all contributed to a production miracle. By June 1943, Hellcats were coming off the assembly line at the rate of one every hour, a pace that Japanese industry, already strained to its limits, couldn't hope to match. American industrial might was transforming the balance of power in the Pacific, one fighter at a time. On the 31st of August 1943, USS Independence was patrolling near Marcus Island. On her deck sat 2 squadrons of F6F Hellcats, the first to reach the combat zone. Lieutenant Commander Charles Crommelin, leading VF6 Squadron, had been briefed on the fighter's capabilities but remained skeptical. The Navy had promised superior aircraft before, only to see them outclassed by the Zero. As Crommelin prepared to lead the first combat mission, he gathered his pilots on the carrier's deck. Many were rookies who had never seen combat. "Remember your training," he told them. "Don't try to turn with the Zeros. Use your power and speed. Dive, shoot, climb away. Don't give them a chance to use their maneuverability." The Hellcats launched from Independence's deck and headed for Marcus Island, where intelligence indicated a concentration of Japanese aircraft. As they approached the target, Crommelin spotted a formation of 15 Zeros rising to meet them. "Here we go, boys," he radioed to his squadron. "Stick to the plan, power dives and zoom climbs. Don't get suckered into turning battles." What happened next would forever change the course of the air war in the Pacific. The Hellcats, diving from 20,000 feet, accelerated to speeds the Zeros couldn't match. Their 6 .50 caliber machine guns, each capable of firing 400 rounds per minute, tore into the Japanese formation. Zero pilots, accustomed to American fighters that tried to dogfight on their terms, were unprepared for the hit-and-run tactics the Hellcats' performance enabled. In less than 5 minutes, 9 Zeros had been shot down. Not a single Hellcat was lost. The remaining Japanese pilots broke off the engagement and fled back to their base. When Crommelin's squadron returned to the Independence, the deck crew could hardly believe the reports. 9-0 kill ratio on the aircraft's first combat mission was unprecedented. As word spread through the fleet, pilots clamored to transfer to Hellcat squadrons. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, received Crommelin's after-action report with cautious optimism. One successful engagement didn't prove the aircraft's superiority, but as more Hellcats reached the front lines and more combat reports flooded in, a pattern became undeniable. The kill ratio wasn't dropping, it was improving as pilots became more familiar with the fighter's capabilities. By October 1943, American factories were producing Hellcats at a rate that shocked even the most optimistic war planners. The Grumman plant in Bethpage delivered 304 fighters that month alone, 10 per day. November saw production rise to 337. By December, the monthly figure had reached 355. It was in this context that Admiral Arima made his fateful observation from the bridge of the Shokaku. Japanese naval intelligence had reported American fighter production numbers that seemed fantastical, over 1,200 Hellcats in a single month across all production facilities. The Admiral initially dismissed these figures as American propaganda, until that day in late 1943 when he witnessed with his own eyes the seemingly endless waves of Hellcats launching from American carriers. Admiral Arima returned to Tokyo in early 1944 with a somber report for the Imperial Japanese Navy High Command. In a wood-panelled conference room deep within the Naval Ministry building, he stood before the assembled admirals and described what he had witnessed. "The Americans are not just replacing their losses," he explained, pointing to intelligence photos spread across the table. "They are fundamentally transforming the balance of power in the Pacific. Their new fighter, the Hellcat, outperforms our Zero in every critical aspect except turning radius, and they are producing them at a rate we cannot possibly match." Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, leaned forward. "How many are they building?" "Our latest intelligence suggests they produced 1,212 Hellcats in January alone," Arima replied. "That's more than our entire fighter production for the last quarter." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Japan's entire naval strategy had been built around the qualitative superiority of its aircraft, particularly the legendary Zero. Since the beginning of the war, Japanese pilots had maintained a favorable kill ratio against American fighters. Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, the Navy minister, broke the silence. Can we match this new fighter? What about the Raiden or the Shiden? Captain Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactical mind who had helped plan the Pearl Harbor attack, shook his head. The Raiden is still plagued with engine problems. The Shiden won't be ready for operational deployment until late this year. Neither can be produced in numbers, even approaching American production. And our pilots? Asked Admiral Toyoda. Arima's expression darkened further. We're losing them faster than we can replace them. The Americans are not just producing superior aircraft, they're producing better trained pilots. Their training programs are churning out hundreds of new pilots every month, while ours. He trailed off, not needing to complete the thought. Japan's pilot training program had been drastically shortened to rush replacements to the front. New Japanese pilots were lucky to have 120 hours of flight, time before combat deployment. American pilots routinely received 300 hours or more. The resulting disparity in skill was becoming increasingly evident with each engagement. So what do you propose, Admiral Arima? Toyoda asked. We must fundamentally rethink our strategy. Arima replied. The war of attrition in the air is one we cannot win. We must conserve our remaining pilots and aircraft for a decisive battle, one that gives us the maximum advantage. Thus began the Japanese Navy's desperate search for a strategy to counter the Hellcats' overwhelming impact. The aircraft that Leroy Grumman and Robert Hall had envisioned just 2 years earlier was now reshaping Japanese grand strategy at the highest levels. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the transformation of American naval air power continued at a breathtaking pace. By February 1944, Hellcats equipped 42 fighter squadrons. The aircraft that commanders had initially greeted with skepticism was now the most requested fighter in the Navy's inventory. At Naval Air Station Alameda in California, Commander John Jimmy Thach, the developer of the famous Thach Weave defensive fighter tactic, was training a new generation of Hellcat pilots. Thach had faced the Zero in the Wildcat during the war's early days and understood better than anyone the monumental shift the Hellcat represented. On a clear morning in March 1944, Thach addressed a class of fighter pilots preparing to deploy to the Pacific. Among them was Ensign Alex Vraciu, a young pilot who would soon become one of the war's greatest aces. Gentlemen, Thach began, you're about to fly the finest carrier fighter in the world. The Hellcat isn't just an airplane, it's a weapons system designed specifically to defeat the Zero. He pointed to a large diagram showing the performance characteristics of both aircraft. The Zero can outturn you, period. Don't try to match it in a turning fight, you'll lose. But you can outclimb it, outdive it, and most importantly, you can take punishment that would disintegrate a Zero. Thach walked to a damaged Hellcat that had been placed in the hangar for training purposes. The fighter had taken over 200 hits from Japanese machine guns, had half its rudder shot away, and one wing badly damaged, yet it had returned to its carrier. This pilot survived, Thach said simply. In a Zero, he'd have been dead before he knew he was hit. He ran his hand along the fighter's armored cockpit. The Hellcat protects you. 6. 50 caliber machine guns give you devastating firepower. Your self-sealing fuel tanks will take multiple hits without burning. But your greatest advantage isn't listed in the technical specifications. What's that, sir? Asked Vraciu. You're part of an industrial juggernaut the likes of which the world has never seen, Thach replied. For every Hellcat lost, 5 more are on the way. The Japanese are running out of pilots, running out of planes, running out of fuel. They know it, and now, so do you. That psychological edge, the knowledge of overwhelming industrial superiority, would prove as important as any technical advantage the Hellcat possessed. American pilots flew with a confidence born of knowing they had the better aircraft and an endless supply of replacements behind them. The spring of 1944 brought a series of massive carrier operations that would test the Hellcats' dominance in combat on an unprecedented scale. Operation Hailstone, targeting the Japanese base at Truk, would be the first. Truk had been considered Japan's most formidable forward base, often called the Gibraltar of the Pacific. The massive lagoon sheltered a significant portion of the Japanese fleet and was defended by hundreds of aircraft. American planners expected fierce resistance. On the 16th of February 1944, Task Force 58 centered around 5 fleet carriers with over 500 aircraft, the majority being Hellcats, struck Truk. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was a massacre. Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu, flying from USS Intrepid, was among the first to engage Japanese fighters rising to defend the base. Having absorbed Thatcher's lessons, Vrasiu didn't attempt to dogfight. Instead, he used the Hellcats' superior power and dive speed to make slashing attacks, zooming away before the Japanese could respond. In less than 8 minutes, Vrasiu shot down 6 Japanese aircraft without taking a single hit. Other Hellcat pilots reported similar success. By day's end, over 30 Japanese fighters had been destroyed for the loss of just 4 Hellcats, and not a single American pilot was killed. Commander Paul Buey, leading Air Group 16 from USS Lexington, described the scene in his after-action report. The enemy fighters attempted to engage using their traditional turning tactics. Our pilots, maintaining discipline, refused to be drawn into such engagements. The resulting combat clearly demonstrated the Hellcats' superiority when properly employed. Enemy pilots appeared increasingly desperate as the engagement continued, attempting maneuvers that exposed them to our superior firepower. The one-sided outcome at Truk wasn't an anomaly, it was becoming the norm wherever Hellcats encountered Japanese aircraft. American pilots began referring to these engagements as turkey shoots for their shocking lack of contest. At Grumman's Bethpage factory, production continued to accelerate. The workforce, now including thousands of women who had never worked in manufacturing before the war, was setting new records monthly. Rosie Miller, a 2-year-old mother of 2 whose husband was serving with the Marines in the Pacific, worked on the Hellcat assembly line riveting wing sections. "Every rivet I drive might save my husband's life," she told a visiting reporter from Life magazine. "When I get tired, I think about him facing those Japanese planes, and suddenly I'm not tired anymore." The human stories behind the Hellcats' production miracle were as remarkable as the technical achievements. Former housewives, school teachers, and department store clerks mastered complex manufacturing skills in weeks. Retirees returned to work to operate machine tools. Teenagers postponed college to contribute to the war effort. Leroy Grumman made a point of walking the factory floor daily, talking with workers, solving problems, and maintaining the personal connection between the company leadership and the production teams. On one such walk in April 1944, he stopped to watch Miller working on a wing assembly. "How's it going, Mrs. Miller?" he asked. She looked up from her work. "Faster every day, Mr. Grumman, but we need to do better. My husband wrote that the Japanese are still putting up a fight." Grumman nodded. "We're hitting 400 Hellcats this month. May will be 450. Miller returned to her riveting. "Make it 500, Mr. Grumman. My husband wants to come home." That conversation, witnessed by several workers, became part of Grumman Company law. Grumman returned to his office and called a meeting of his production managers. By the end of the day, new schedules had been set targeting 500 Hellcats for May. They would produce 514. Back in the Pacific, planning was underway for the largest carrier operation in history. Admiral Raymond Spruance's Fifth Fleet would launch Operation Forager in June 1944, the invasion of the Mariana Islands, including Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These islands would provide airfields for the new B-29 Superfortress bombers that could reach the Japanese home islands. The Japanese High Command recognized the existential threat. If American bombers could reach the home islands, Japan's cities constructed primarily of wood and paper would be devastated. The Marianas had to be held at all costs. Admiral Toyoda activated Operation Eigo, the plan for a decisive carrier battle that had been developed following Admiral Arima's warning. The remaining strength of the Japanese carrier force would be committed to stop the PASO, American invasion. On the 11th of June 1944, the American invasion fleet arrived off Saipan. Japanese land-based aircraft immediately began attacking the American ships. Hellcats from the escort carriers, providing close air support for the invasion, intercepted these attacks with devastating efficiency. Lieutenant Commander Philip Torrey, leading a division of Hellcats from USS Kitkun Bay, intercepted a formation of 16 Japanese bombers approaching the invasion beaches. His flight of 4 Hellcats attacked without hesitation, despite being outnumbered 4-1. Torrey later wrote, "The Japanese pilots were clearly inexperienced. Their formation discipline broke down at the first sign of our attack. We were able to isolate and destroy individual aircraft with minimal risk to ourselves. The Hellcat's superior speed allowed us to dictate the terms of engagement completely." In that single interception, Torrey's division destroyed 11 Japanese aircraft while suffering no losses. Similar scenarios played out repeatedly as the Japanese attempted to disrupt the landings with air attacks. By June 15, Japanese land-based air power in the Marianas had been effectively neutralized, but the main Japanese carrier force was still approaching. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's fleet, centered around 9 carriers with over 450 aircraft, was steaming toward the Marianas for what would become known as the Battle of the Philippine Sea. American intelligence detected the approaching Japanese fleet, and Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 prepared to meet it. Mitcher commanded 15 carriers with over 900 aircraft, including more than 450 Hellcats. On the morning of the 19th of June, 1944, Ozawa launched the first of 4 massive airstrikes against the American fleet. What followed would become known to history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the most one-sided carrier battle of the war. Lieutenant Alex Vrasiu, now flying from USS Lexington, was among the Hellcat pilots who met the first Japanese attack wave. Having already proven himself in combat over Truk, Vrasiu was positioned to intercept the incoming Japanese aircraft before they could reach the American fleet. When the air controllers reported over 70 incoming aircraft, Vrasiu's squadron raced to intercept them. Climbing to 20,000 feet, the Hellcat pilots held the altitude advantage as the Japanese formation appeared on the horizon. "Lexington Squadron, this is Vrasiu," he radioed. "Remember your training. Don't get suckered into turning fights. Hit and climb. Hit and climb." The Hellcats dove into the Japanese formation with devastating effect. Vrasiu later described the scene. "It was like they were flying in slow motion. Their planes looked like they were hanging in the air. We came down on them so fast they barely had time to react. In just 8 minutes, Vrasiu shot down 6 Japanese dive bombers without taking a hit. Later that day, he would add 2 more to his tally, becoming an ace in a day by downing 8 enemy aircraft in a single day's combat. His experience wasn't unique. Throughout the massive air battle, Hellcat pilots reported similar success stories. By day's end, over 300 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed, compared to just 29 American losses. The vast majority of American pilots who went down were rescued by submarine and destroyer picket ships specifically stationed for that purpose. Another advantage the resource-rich Americans could provide that the Japanese could not match. The devastating one-sidedness of the battle wasn't just due to the Hellcats' technical superiority. It reflected the culmination of an entire industrial and training ecosystem that the Americans had built while the Japanese had steadily degraded under the pressures of war. The Japanese pilots facing the Americans over the Philippine Sea had, on average, less than 100 hours of flight time. Many had never landed on a carrier before being sent into combat. In contrast, American pilots averaged over 300 hours of training before deployment, including extensive carrier qualification time. When Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, commander of Air Group 15 from USS Essex, shot down 7 Japanese aircraft in a single mission during the battle, he was demonstrating not just personal skill, but the success of an entire system designed to produce superior fighter pilots flying superior aircraft in overwhelming numbers. After the battle, Admiral Ozawa reported to Tokyo that his forces had been devastated. Our fighter pilots, despite fighting bravely, were overwhelmed by the American Hellcats. The enemy fighters appear to be flown by pilots with superior training and tactical discipline. We must face the reality that we can no longer challenge American carrier air power on equal terms. For the Japanese leadership, the implications were catastrophic. Their carefully hoarded naval air strength, conserved for months for this decisive battle, had been annihilated in a single day. The fear that Admiral Arima had expressed 6 months earlier had been fully realized. Back at Grumman's factories, news of the Marianas turkey shoot was met with pride but not complacency. Robert Hall, now overseeing both production improvements and development of the F6F5 variant with improved armament options, called a meeting of his engineering team. "The Hellcat is winning the war in the Pacific," he told them. "But we can't slow down now. The Japanese are desperate, which makes them dangerous. We need to keep improving the aircraft and keep the production lines running at maximum capacity." The F6F5 variant introduced the ability to carry rockets in addition to bombs, making the Hellcat even more versatile for ground attack missions. As American forces advanced across the Pacific, the need for fighter bombers to support amphibious landings was growing. The Hellcat, originally designed purely as an interceptor, proved remarkably adaptable to this new role. By August 1944, Grumman had delivered the 5,000th Hellcat. In just 18 months of production, the company had produced more fighters than Japan had built in the entire war to date. This milestone aircraft was specially marked and flown directly to Pearl Harbor, where Admiral Chester Nimitz himself came aboard the delivery carrier to inspect it. Running his hand along the fighter's fuselage, Nimitz turned to the assembled press photographers. "This aircraft represents American ingenuity and industrial might at its finest," he said. "The Hellcat has changed the course of the Pacific War more decisively than any other single-weapon system." While Nimitz's statement made for good publicity, it contained a profound truth that military historians would later confirm. No other American weapon had so completely reversed the tactical equation in a major theater of war in so short a time. In October 1944, the Hellcat faced its greatest test yet during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. As American forces returned to the Philippines, the Japanese Navy committed its remaining strength in a desperate attempt to disrupt the landings. The battle stretched across 3 days and multiple engagements covering over 100,000 square miles of ocean. Throughout the sprawling conflict, Hellcats maintained complete air superiority, protecting the vulnerable American invasion fleet from air attack while hunting the Japanese surface forces. Commander David McCampbell, already the Navy's leading ace, set a record that still stands during the opening phase of the battle. Flying from USS Essex on October 24, McCampbell and his wingman intercepted a Japanese formation of 60 aircraft approaching the American fleet. Rather than waiting for reinforcements, McCampbell attacked immediately. In a combat action that defies belief, McCampbell shot down 9 Japanese aircraft in a single mission, while his wingman accounted for 6 more. When he landed back on Essex after the 95-minute engagement, his Hellcat had just 2 rounds of ammunition left. When asked later how he had achieved such an extraordinary feat, McCampbell's answer was telling, "I just kept pushing that throttle forward and making high-side runs. The Hellcat could outclimb anything they had, so I'd zoom up, roll over, pick a target, dive down, hit it, and climb away before they could touch me." His matter-of-fact description belied the incredible skill required, but it also highlighted the fundamental tactical advantage the Hellcat provided. American pilots could dictate the terms of engagement, choosing when and how to fight based on their aircraft's superior performance envelope. As 1,944 drew to a close, the statistics told a devastating story for Japan. In just 18 months of combat, Hellcat pilots had destroyed over 5,000 Japanese aircraft in air-to-air combat, while losing fewer than 300 Hellcats to enemy fighters. The 1:9 kill ratio was unprecedented in modern warfare. More tellingly, by December 1944, American intelligence reported that Japanese carriers were sailing with their flight decks empty, not because they lacked aircraft, but because they had run out of pilots to fly them. At the Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters in Tokyo, Admiral Toyoda convened a somber meeting of his senior staff. The subject: how to employ their remaining naval air power most effectively in a war they were now certain to lose. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, spoke with brutal honesty. "We have perhaps 1,500 naval aircraft remaining, but fewer than 800 pilots of combat quality. The Americans are producing over 500 Hellcats every month. Each one is flown by a pilot with more training hours than our best remaining aviators. We cannot win a war of attrition in the air." "What do you propose?" Toyoda asked. Fuchida hesitated, then replied, "We must consider tactics that do not require our pilots to return." Thus was born the organized kamikaze strategy, a final, desperate attempt to counter American technological and industrial superiority with the sacrifice of Japan's remaining pilots. It was the ultimate acknowledgement that conventional air tactics had failed against the Hellcat and the system that produced it. Even this grim escalation would ultimately fail against the Hellcat. The fighter's rugged construction, with its armored cockpit and self-sealing fuel tanks, made it remarkably resistant to kamikaze tactics. Hellcats shot down hundreds of kamikazes before they could reach their targets, and when direct interception failed, the fighters would actually ram the suicide aircraft, often surviving the collision to return to their carriers. In Bethpage, as news of the kamikaze tactics reached the Grumman workforce, production took on an even greater urgency. Workers added extra shifts, volunteering for 12-hour days, 6 days a week. The factory's output reached its peak in March 1945, with 605 Hellcats produced in that single month. Rosie Miller, still riveting wings after 2 years on the production line, spoke for many when a supervisor asked if she needed a day off. "Not until it's over," she replied. "Not until they're all home." The final chapter of the Hellcats' War came during the Okinawa campaign in April-June 1945. The island, just 340 miles from the Japanese home islands, was defended with fanatical determination. Kamikaze attacks reached their peak intensity, with over 1,500 suicide missions flown against the American fleet. Hellcats, now flying from both large fleet carriers and smaller escort carriers, formed the primary defense against these attacks. Flying combat air patrols around the clock, the Hellcat pilots established a series of defensive rings around the fleet, intercepting kamikazes at maximum range. Lieutenant Junior Grade George Glacken, flying from USS Bennington, intercepted a formation of 25 kamikazes on the 12th of April 1945. Despite being outnumbered, he attacked without hesitation, shooting down 4, before running out of ammunition. Rather than returning to his carrier, he continued to disrupt the formation by making dry firing runs, forcing the Japanese pilots to break formation and become easier targets for other American fighters. For his extraordinary courage, Glacken was awarded the Navy Cross. His citation noted, "His aggressive fighting spirit and tactical skill reflected the finest traditions of naval aviation and were in keeping with the superior performance characteristics of his aircraft." By war's end, the statistics were staggering. Hellcat pilots had destroyed 5,163 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, 75% of all Navy air-to-air victories in the Pacific. The aircraft had flown over 66,000 combat sorties, dropped 6,500 tons of bombs, and fired over 20,000 rockets at ground targets. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Hellcats story wasn't the technical achievement or the production miracle, but the human dimension, the connection between the factory workers who built the fighter and the pilots who flew it into combat. This connection was personified in an extraordinary exchange that began in November 1944. Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, one of the Navy's first aces and a Medal of Honor recipient, visited the Grumman plant while on leave. O'Hare had transitioned from the Wildcat to the Hellcat and wanted to meet the people who built the aircraft that had revolutionized his combat experience. As he walked the production line, shaking hands with workers, O'Hare stopped at Rosie Miller's station. "Mrs. Miller," he said, reading her name badge, "I just wanted to thank you. Your rivets saved my life last month." Miller looked up, surprised. "How's that, Commander?" O'Hare pointed to a spot on the wing section she was working on. "Right there. Took a 20mm cannon shell from a Zero, blew a hole big enough to put my fist through, but your rivets held. Wing stayed on, and I made it home." Miller wiped her hands on her coveralls, and "I didn't have look times the time stand for the 12, shook O'Hare's hand. "My husband's a Marine in the Pacific. You bring him home safe, Commander." "That's the plan, ma'am," O'Hare replied. "Every Zero we shoot down gets him one step closer." Before leaving, O'Hare left his squadron patch with Miller, promising to write if he ever encountered her husband's unit. 2 weeks later, in a remarkable coincidence, O'Hare's carrier task force was providing air support for the Marine landing at Peleliu. Among the Marines he was protecting was Staff Sergeant James Miller Rosie's husband. O'Hare kept his promise. After flying a close air support mission where his rockets had destroyed a Japanese bunker threatening a Marine unit, he learned that unit included Miller's husband. He wrote to Rosie immediately, "Your rivets kept me in the air, and that allowed me to keep your husband safe on the ground. That's how we're going to win this war, all of us doing our part in this great chain that connects the factory floor to the front lines." This interconnectedness, this sense that victory was being forged through the combined efforts of millions of Americans, each contributing their specific skills, became a powerful theme in how the Hellcat story was understood both during the war and in historical accounts afterward. The scale of the achievement became even more apparent as Allied intelligence units began interrogating captured Japanese naval officers in the war's final months. Commander Masatake Okumiya, who had overseen Japanese naval fighter tactics development, provided particularly candid assessments. The appearance of the Hellcat in such overwhelming numbers represented the moment when we knew the air war was lost. Okumiya told his interrogators, "We had based our entire strategy on maintaining qualitative superiority in the air. The Hellcat not only neutralized that advantage but reversed it completely." When asked why Japan had been unable to develop a comparable fighter in time, Okumiya's answer was revealing, "We could design such an aircraft. We could not build them in the thousands per month." America's industrial capacity was the decisive factor, not just the machines, but the people operating them. This assessment was particularly remarkable, coming from an officer of a nation where technical prowess and engineering excellence were points of intense national pride. The acknowledgement that the true American advantage lay not just in design but in production capacity represented a profound shift in how warfare itself was understood. As Allied forces closed in on Japan in the summer of 1945, Hellcats continued to demonstrate their versatility and effectiveness. While the newer F-4U Corsair had joined the fleet in significant numbers, the Hellcat remained the backbone of Navy carrier operations through to the war's end. In the final carrier raids against the Japanese home islands in July and August 1945, Hellcats flew thousands of sorties, striking airfields, harbour installations, and factories. The Japanese air defence was by now a hollow shell, with precious few fighters rising to challenge the American formations. When encountered, these last defenders were typically flown by hastily trained pilots, with barely enough skill to get their aircraft airborne. Many were little more than teenagers, rushed through abbreviated training programs in a desperate attempt to defend their homeland. Lieutenant Junior Grade Willis Hardy, flying from USS Bennington during the July 24th strikes against Kure Naval Base, described encountering a lone Japanese fighter. He couldn't have been more than 18 years old, flying an obsolete Zero trainer. His attacks were completely uncoordinated, no tactical awareness at all. I could have shot him down easily, but I chose to damage his aircraft in a way that forced him to bail out. This wasn't combat, it was slaughter of an untrained boy. That's when I truly understood how completely we had won the air war. Hardy's humane decision to spare the young pilot when he could have easily killed him reflected a growing awareness among American aviators that their victory was now absolute. The technical and industrial superiority that the Hellcat embodied had so completely overwhelmed Japan's air defenses that the outcome was beyond doubt. This realization added poignancy to what would be the Hellcat's final combat action of World War II. On the 15th of August 1945, hours after Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender but before the ceasefire had been fully implemented, a group of 14 Hellcats from USS Yorktown encountered 20 Japanese fighters near Tokyo. The Japanese pilots, apparently unaware of the surrender announcement, attacked the American formation. In the ensuing dogfight, the Hellcats shot down all 20 Japanese aircraft without a single loss. These would be the last aerial victories of World War II. When the Yorktown pilots landed and reported the engagement, their commander informed them of the surrender. The pilots' reactions were mixed pride in their perfect victory, but also somber reflection that these final kills had come against an enemy already defeated at the highest level. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Valencia, who had led the flight and personally shot down 3 aircraft in this final engagement, wrote in his journal that night, "Today I shot down the last enemy aircraft I will ever engage. I feel no triumph, only relief that it's over, and hope that the world never again sees a conflict of this scale and devastation. The Hellcat did its job. Now it's time for all of us to do the harder work of building peace." The war's end brought a swift conclusion to Hellcat production. With Japan's surrender on the 15th of August 1945, the need for thousands of naval fighters evaporated overnight. Grumman received a stop work order on August 18, halting production at 12,275 aircraft, a number that still stands as a record for any American fighter aircraft. At the Bethpage factory, the reaction to the war's end was complex. Joy at victory and relief that loved ones would soon return home, mixed with uncertainty about the future. For thousands of workers, particularly women who had entered industrial work for the first time, the question of what next loomed large. Rosie Miller, who had riveted Hellcat wings for over 2 years, received 2 pieces of news within days of each other. First, that her husband James would be returning home from the Pacific. Second, that her position at Grumman would end in 2 weeks as production wound down. When a reporter asked how she felt about losing her job, Miller's response was philosophical. "I came here to do a job, help win the war, and bring my husband home. Both those jobs are finished now. I'm proud of what we accomplished, but I won't miss the long hours and the aching back. Time for the men to have their jobs back and for me to have my husband back." Not all women shared Miller's readiness to return to pre-war domestic roles. Many had discovered abilities and independence they hadn't known they possessed, and were reluctant to surrender their newfound economic and social freedom. The massive demobilization of the female industrial workforce represented a complex social transition that would influence American society for decades to come. For the engineers who had created the Hellcat, the war's end brought new challenges and opportunities. Robert Hall, whose insistence on a clean-sheet fighter design had been vindicated so completely, found himself at the forefront of the jet age. His expertise in fighter design would prove invaluable as Grumman developed its first jet aircraft, the F-9F Panther. Leroy Grumman faced the challenge of converting his company from wartime to peacetime production. The abrupt cancellation of military contracts created a precarious financial situation, but Grumman's reputation for engineering excellence and the capital accumulated during the war years provided a foundation for diversification. In October 1945, as the nation adjusted to peace, the Navy organized a ceremony aboard the USS Yorktown to commemorate the Hellcat's contribution to victory. The deck of the carrier was arrayed with 5,163 small flags, one for each confirmed aerial victory by Hellcat pilots during the war. Admiral Chester Nimitz, addressing the assembled pilots, engineers, and production workers, put the achievement in perspective. The Grumman Hellcat did more to turn the tide in the Pacific War than any other single weapon system. From the moment it entered combat, the course of the air war changed fundamentally and permanently in our favor. This aircraft represents what America does best, identifying a problem, applying our technical ingenuity to solve it, and then producing the solution in overwhelming numbers. Among those present was Captain David McCampbell, whose 34 aerial victories made him the Navy's all-time leading ace. When asked by a reporter to explain the Hellcat's extraordinary success, McCampbell gave a surprisingly nuanced answer. The Hellcat was perfectly matched to its mission and to its pilots. It wasn't designed to outmaneuver the Zero. It was designed to outfight it by emphasizing different qualities: power, ruggedness, firepower, and protection. His assessment highlighted a profound truth about the Hellcat's development. Its success stemmed not from pursuing absolute technical superiority in all aspects of performance, but from a clear-eyed assessment of what qualities would provide the greatest tactical advantage in actual combat conditions. The Japanese built a ballerina, McCampbell continued. We built a boxer. In aerial combat, the boxer won. As the formal ceremonies concluded, an unexpected moment occurred that would later be remembered as capturing the essence of the Hellcat story. Robert Hall, the engineer whose vision had shaped the fighter, found himself standing next to Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu, whose 19 aerial victories made him the Navy's fourth-ranking ace. Mr. Hall, Vrasiu said, extending his hand, I've waited a long time to thank you personally. Your airplane brought me home when nothing else would have. Hall seemed embarrassed by the praise. You're the one who deserves the thanks. We just built the tools. You used them? No, Vrasiu insisted. When I got hit over Manila, I took over 30 cannon shells in my engine and wings. Any other aircraft would have disintegrated. The Hellcat stayed together long enough for me to ditch near a destroyer that picked me up. You didn't just build a fighter, Mr. Hall. You built a life insurance policy for thousands of pilots. This exchange, overheard and later recorded by a Navy photographer, encapsulated the relationship between the designers, builders, and users of the Hellcat. Each group recognized their dependence on the others in the great industrial military ecosystem that had produced victory. The Hellcat's legacy extended far beyond the war years. In the immediate post-war period, it remained in service as the Navy's primary fighter, while jet aircraft were being developed and tested. During this transitional period, Hellcats served as trainers, allowing a new generation of naval aviators to develop their skills on an aircraft with forgiving flight characteristics. More significantly, the lessons learned from the Hellcat program shaped American fighter development for decades to come. The emphasis on power, speed, and firepower, rather than extreme maneuverability, became a defining characteristic of American fighter design philosophy through the jet age. The F-4 Phantom II, which would become America's primary fighter during the Vietnam War, reflected this same philosophy, a powerful, heavily armed aircraft that relied on energy management rather than turning ability to win aerial combat. Like the Hellcat, it would achieve remarkable success against more agile opponents by fighting to its strengths rather than engaging on the enemy's terms. Beyond technical lessons, the Hellcat's development and production established organizational patterns that would serve American industry well in future conflicts. The close collaboration between military requirements officers, design engineers, production managers, and frontline users created a feedback loop that continuously improved the aircraft throughout its service life. This integrated approach to weapon system development would become standard practice in American defense procurement, with combat feedback directly informing both ongoing production refinements and next-generation designs. For the Japanese military and industrial leadership, the Hellcat represented a harsh lesson in the realities of modern industrial warfare. Admiral Matome Ugaki, who had commanded Japanese naval air forces, wrote in his post-war memoirs, "The appearance of the Hellcat in such overwhelming numbers forced us to confront the fundamental mismatch between Japanese and American industrial capacity. We could never have matched their production even if our designs had been superior, which, after mid-1943, they were not." This recognition that industrial capacity was as important as technical design, that quantity had a quality all its own, represented a profound shift in military thinking. Future conflicts would be approached with greater awareness of the industrial dimension of warfare, with logistics and production capacity given equal consideration alongside tactical and strategic factors. The human story of the Hellcat continued long after the war ended. Rosie Miller's husband, James, returned safely from the Pacific, and they raised 3 children in suburban Long Island. In a twist that seemed to close a historical circle, their eldest son would later work for Grumman as an engineer on the Apollo lunar module program, another instance of American engineering rising to meet an unprecedented challenge. Robert Hall continued his distinguished career at Grumman, contributing to numerous aircraft designs before retiring in 1970. When interviewed for an oral history project shortly before his death in 1991, he was asked what he considered his greatest professional achievement. "The Hellcat saved more lives than it took," he replied after consideration. "We built an aircraft that brought its pilots home, even when severely damaged. There were better performing fighters, faster fighters, more advanced fighters, but none that served their primary purpose, keeping the pilot alive to fight another day better than the Hellcat." Leroy Grumman, whose company had risen from modest beginnings to become one of America's premier aircraft manufacturers through the Hellcat's success, maintained his hands-on approach to leadership until his retirement. He insisted that engineering excellence and build quality were non-negotiable values, establishing a corporate culture that would serve the company well through the jet age, the space program, and beyond. The pilots who had flown the Hellcat in combat carried their experiences into civilian life, many becoming leaders in business, government, and education. Their success stemmed partly from the confidence gained from mastering complex machinery under the most demanding conditions imaginable: aerial combat, where mistakes were rarely survived. Admiral John S. Thatch, whose tactical innovations had helped Hellcat pilots maximize their aircraft's advantages, reflected on this aspect in a 1980 interview. "The Hellcat was more than just a weapon system. It was a confidence builder. Pilots knew they had an aircraft that could take punishment, deliver decisive firepower, and get them home. That confidence translated directly into combat effectiveness." In 1972, as the United States found itself embroiled in another Pacific conflict in Vietnam, a group of naval aviators gathered at the National Air and Space Museum for the installation of a preserved F6F Hellcat in the World War II Aviation Gallery. Among them were David McCampbell and Alexander Vrasiu, the legendary aces whose exploits had helped establish the fighter's reputation. As they stood before the gleaming aircraft, now a museum piece rather than a weapon of war, a young Navy pilot currently flying F-4 Phantoms in Vietnam approached them with a question. "What made the Hellcat so special? We have aircraft now that are 3 times as fast, with radar and missiles you couldn't have imagined." McCampbell considered the question carefully before answering. "The Hellcat was special because it was exactly what was needed, exactly when it was needed, in exactly the quantities required. It matched the strategic moment perfectly." Vrasiu nodded in agreement and added, "And because it was built by people who understood that every rivet, every weld, every connection mattered. They weren't just building an airplane, they were building our survival." That understanding that material production in war is never merely about machines, but about the humans who make them and the humans whose lives depend on them, remains perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Hellcat story. It reminds us that even in an age of technological warfare, the human dimension remains paramount. When Japanese admirals looked to the horizon in 1943 and saw waves of Hellcats launching from American carriers, what truly broke their resolve wasn't just the technical capabilities of a new fighter aircraft. It was the glimpse they caught of America's full potential, unleashed the collaborative power of engineers, workers, pilots, and strategists, all focused on a common goal, moving with speed and determination that seemed unstoppable. In that moment of clarity, watching 1,200 Hellcats arrive in a single month, when their entire aviation industry couldn't match that output in a year, they recognized a fundamental truth. Industrial democracy, when fully mobilized, possessed power beyond anything they had calculated in their war plans. The war was, indeed, over not because one aircraft was superior to another, but because one nation had demonstrated capacity and determination that could not be matched. The Hellcat thus stands as more than a successful fighter aircraft. It represents a pivotal moment when American industrial and technical prowess decisively shaped world history, demonstrating that in modern warfare, victory belongs not just to the brave, but to those who can arm the brave most effectively. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.